Exodus 1, 8-10. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them. In the previous episode, we demonstrated the clear evidence how the Israelite encampment grew into the size of a large city, displaying their prosperity and thriving society within Egypt. So we expect to find the evidence among the archaeological record that there was a sudden decline in fortune as they were flung into a world of servitude and labor. Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions inside a turquoise mine near Serabit el-Kadamin in Sinai, Egypt, is the earliest alphabetic language ever found. It appears to be some form of Egyptian, but it cannot be read as hieroglyph, but rather as a phonetic script, the earliest ever found, and it has been determined to be the precursor to the ancient Hebrew we know today. It dates to the time of Joseph's power in Egypt, and the script was written by a Semitic miner crying out to a singular god, El, the name for God found in Genesis. This finding confirms what many scholars have long suspected, that Joseph, who fully understood the spoken and written Egyptian language, would have developed a new writing system for his people to learn. But rather than utilizing the extremely difficult pictographic form of writing, he developed a much more simplified form of writing used in alphabetic form that can be read phonetically, as English is also based. In this way, the people could have more easily learned the written language of ancient Hebrew. We can also demonstrate that this script also would eventually give rise to Phoenician, Aramaic, and later Greek and Latin. Therefore, by analyzing the characteristics of both Egyptian hieroglyph and Proto-Sinaitic scripts, experts can prove that the former is a direct influence of the latter. So, if the Israelites never sojourned in Egypt, then Proto-Sinaitic and early Hebrew would have never developed in the first place. Yet here it is, etched into a cave wall where slaves were forced to mine turquoise. Just outside of these mines, at the top of the mountain, is the ruins of the Temple of Hathor, the goddess to whom turquoise is dedicated. On the many stelae throughout the grounds here have inscriptions that, of course, dedicate this mountain to Hathor. However, what is also inscribed is a number of Semitic names of those who worked here. Genesis tells us that Pharaoh perceived Israelites as a threat, and he took the following action in verse 11. Accordingly, they put taskmasters over the Israelites to wear them down by forced labor. Therefore, it brings to light how an apparent lowly slave could have possibly been able to etch such a well-written message inside that cave. They were educated and prospering as a community, then almost immediately thrown into forced labor. The carvings prove that the Egyptians used Canaanite slaves for mining. At this stage, the Egyptians became more ruthless to the Israelites, seeing that their numbers only continued to increase under bondage. This leads Pharaoh to make a dreadful and damning decision, to have every Hebrew boy thrown into the Nile. Archaeological record from this precise period of time reveal that 25% of the cemetery population consists of infant burials. At Avaris alone, that number skyrockets to 50%. Of the remaining adult burials, there are 3 females to every 2 males. Experts conclude that this would mean that these infant remains are mostly male, which concludes that there was a strong bias of mostly females in the adult population under slavery. Ancient Jewish scholar Artapanus offered the only ancient document that named the pharaoh who decreed this infanticide. By translating the ancient Hebrew name back to Egyptian, we get Kanefera, which fits only one pharaoh in the ancient record, and he happens to fall into just this right period. He can be identified as Kanefer Sobekatep IV. the 29th ruler of the 13th dynasty. He fits perfectly in with this period. One other vital piece of evidence we find for this population of Semites showing an age of prosperity in the archaeological record within the graves, then abruptly becoming impoverished, there is a sudden lack of food and nutrients, and the average life expectancy decreases. And this sudden change takes us just to the right time. The Brooklyn Papyrus, a medical papyrus dating to 450 BC, has been rewritten from an earlier document said to be from the 13th dynasty of Egypt. Again, just the right time. In it lists slaves in Egypt at that period. Roughly 70% of the names found in the papyrus are in fact Semitic names, along with their gender. Some include the name of the tribes they are from. Among them found was from the tribe of Issachar, and another from Asher. Most surprisingly among the list is an uncommon name of Shipra, a Hebrew midwife from the time of Moses. These are compelling pieces of evidence. These are slave lists deriving specifically from the 13th dynasty, right where we expect to see it. When you have genuine texts like this, suddenly you have real history. In archaeology, you have to interpret, but text, you now have hard evidence for directly corroborating with our Genesis account. The reason why Egyptologists and historians don't accept all that we've shown here is because it all comes from the wrong time period, as we stated 2 episodes earlier, when compared to the traditional understanding of the account. They were always looking for evidence in the Genesis account in the time of Ramses II in the New Kingdom period. However, based on what we've been displaying until now, we can definitely state that all these events took place much earlier in the Middle Kingdom period, and suddenly all the evidence we expect to find appears in the archaeological record. Moving forward into the book of Exodus and the final stage of the Hebrews' sojourn in Egypt, we read that, under instruction from Yahweh God, Moses demands Pharaoh to let his enslaved people leave Egypt. Each time, Pharaoh rejects his wishes. Then God releases a plague upon him and his land. We have Egyptian documentation revealing these plagues. Found in the 3rd pylon of the Temple of Karnak in Thebes between 1947 and 1951, the Ahmose or Tempest Stele was found. The name Ahmose was given to him by his reigning father, Pharaoh of Egypt, which is a play on words. Firstly, the Egyptian Lachmis, meaning born of La. Secondly, it can be translated as brother of Moses. Not only does it outline several of the same plagues in Exodus 1, but it also mentions the wrath of God in singular, a clear departure from the Egyptian norm of the use of the gods in plural. Another document found was the Ipuwer Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian hieratic papyrus made during the 19th dynasty of Egypt, now held in the Dutch National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, Netherlands. It describes the blood-red waters during the plagues, along with the plague of fire and hail. Is there evidence of these catastrophes prior to the Exodus? Absolutely. What are called the avarice plague pits? Beatak and his team excavated shallow pits with many of the Egyptian dead carelessly thrown in and rapidly buried, some even thrown on top of each other as though done in haste. Beatak confirms this emergency burial was a response to a plague for a fear of contamination. It is at this point that we see Avaris is completely abandoned and the Semitic people simply vanish. Manetho was an Egyptian priest from Sabinitos who lived in the Ptolemaic period in the 3rd century BC. he wrote what is called the Egyptiaca, or the History of Egypt. Much of his work has been lost. However, some of his work survives from his quotations used by Romano-Jewish scholar and historian Josephus. Writing in Greek, Josephus quotes Manetho, mentioning that in the time of Ptolemaeus, in his reign, for what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us. Again, we see God written in singular, not plural. He continues, and unexpectedly, from the regions of the east, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force they easily seized it, without striking a blow, and having overpowered the rulers of the land, they then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with a cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. From this quote, we can gather a number of very important elements that can now confirm more about the story. Ptolemaeus is the Greek name given to the Egyptian pharaoh Dudimos. This would have been the pharaoh that Moses demanded, "Let my people go," and should be the pharaoh that chases Moses and the Israelites to the Red Sea and drowned. Also, from this text, it confirms that the Hyksos were the foreign Asiatics that came into Egypt after the Israelites left. They took Avaris as their own, while easily overtaking Egypt because, as we know, Egypt was rendered defenseless with their pharaoh and his army now buried under the sea. We can now confirm that Dudimos was in fact the pharaoh who chased the Israelites to the Red Sea. Found on a fragment of the royal canon of Turin, column 6, we find the last sub-dynasty lineage that enslaved the Israelites, where Cannefer Sobekatep IV is mentioned, whom we already identified earlier. However, on this fragment, it tells us who the pharaoh was that preceded him. Why is this important? Because it identifies that it was Pharaoh Sihithor that was the stepfather of Moses. Examining columns 6 to 8 of this fragment, we find a list of successive pharaohs. If we count the number of years after this period of enslavement, we get roughly 40 to 45 years. So by counting forward 45 years in this document, it brings us to column 7. The fragmenting at this point worsens, but we can clearly identify one name on this small remnant, and it reads 40th King Dudimos. This can now confirm that Djennefer Dudimos II is the pharaoh of the Exodus. Interestingly, as we would expect, his tomb has never been found. What's more interesting is that there is no record of Dudimos having a son to take the throne after his death. The 10th and final plague took all male firstborns, including pharaohs. Join me next time, where we join the Israelites on their departure from Egypt to escape subjugation in the Exodus, here on Evidence Uncovered.